Total war is warfare that includes any and all civilian-associated resources and infrastructure as legitimate military targets, and justifies using weapons and tactics that result in significant civilian or other non-combatant casualties, whether collateral damage or not. American English Dictionary defines total war as war that is unrestricted in terms of the weapons used, the territory or combatants involved, or the objectives pursued, especially one in which the laws of war are disregarded. The term can also be applied when the war effort requires significant sacrifices by most of the friendly civilian population. In the mid-19th century, scholars identified total war as a separate class of warfare. In a total war, to an extent inapplicable to less total conflicts, the differentiation between combatants and non-combatants diminishes and even sometimes vanishes entirely, as opposing sides can consider nearly every human resource, even that of non-combatants, as nevertheless part of the war effort. Actions that may characterize the post-19th century concept of total war include strategic bombing, as during World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War; blockade and sieging of population centers, as per the Siege of Leningrad and the Allied blockade of Germany during the First and Second World Wars; scorched earth policy, as per the March to the Sea during the American Civil War and the Japanese Three Ols policy during the Second Sino-Japanese War; commerce raiding, tonnage war, and unrestricted submarine warfare, as per privateering, the German U-boat campaigns of the First and Second World Wars, and the United States submarine campaign against Japan during World War II. Collective punishment, pacification operations, and reprisals against populations deemed hostile, as per the execution and deportation of suspected communists following the fall of the 1871 Paris Commune, or German reprisal policy targeting resistance movements, insurgents, and interventions such as in France and Poland. The use of civilians and prisoners of war as forced labor for military operations, as with Japan and Germany's massive use of forced laborers of other nations during World War II, giving no quarter, as with Hitler's commando order during World War II. Etymology. One can trace back the phrase to the publication in 1935 of World War I memoir of German General Erich Ludendorff, Der Totale Krieg. Some authors extend the concept back as far as classic work of Karl von Clausewitz, On War, as Absoluter Krieg. However, different authors interpret the relevant passages in diverging ways. Total war also describes the French guerre outrance during the Franco-Prussian War. During the American Civil War, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman stated that to win and end the war with fewest possible casualties, he must wage hard war against not only enemy combatants but also enemy civilians on the home front who engaged in arms and food production for the war effort of the Confederacy. By destroying infrastructure vital to the Confederate war effort and striking a serious blow at civilian morale, he thought that it would seriously impair the ability of the Confederacy to continue resistance and thus would turn its populace against their leadership. In his letter to his Chief of Staff, Union General Henry Halleck, on 24 December 1864 described that the Union was not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people, and must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war, as well as their organized armies, defending Sherman's march to the sea. The operation that inflicted widespread destruction of infrastructure in Georgia. United States Air Force General Curtis LeMay updated the concept for the nuclear age. In 1949, he first proposed that a total war in the nuclear age would consist of delivering the entire nuclear arsenal in a single overwhelming blow, going as far as killing a nation. Early history. Utilizing every means available to destroy one's enemy and any of their interests is an obvious strategy, and even the most primitive forms of warfare give evidence of it. See the section Intertribal warfare. The Late Bronze Age collapse saw methodical invasion and destruction of cities, populations, wealth and means of production by competing tribal groups, states and empires in the eastern Mediterranean. Although cities had been sacked before, the systematic nature and scale of these campaigns stand out. During the Middle Ages, destruction under the Mongol Empire in the 13th century effectively exemplified total war. The military forces of Genghis Khan slaughtered whole populations and destroyed any city that resisted. As an aggressor nation, the ancient Mongols, no less than the modern Nazis, practiced total war against an enemy by organizing all available resources, including military personnel, non-combatant workers, intelligence, transport, money, and provisions. 18th and 19th centuries. Intertribal warfare. Author and historian Mark van der Logt wrote, although military historians tend to reserve the concept of total war for conflicts between modern industrial nations, the term nevertheless most closely approaches the state of affairs between the Pawnees and the Sioux and Cheyennes. Both sides directed their actions not solely against warrior combatants but against the people as a whole. Non-combatants were legitimate targets. Indeed, the taking of a scalp of a woman or child was considered honorable because it signified that the scalp taker had dared to enter the very heart of the enemy's territory. French Revolutionary Wars and Napoleonic Wars. The French Revolutionary Wars introduced some of the first concepts of total war, such as mass conscription. The fledgling republic found itself threatened by a powerful coalition of European nations. The only solution, in the eyes of the Jacobin government, was to pour the entire nation's resources into an unprecedented war effort. This was the advent of the levée en masse. The following decree of the National Convention on August 23, 1793 demonstrates the immensity of the French war effort. When the French frontline forces grew to some 800,000 with a total of 1.5 million in all services, the first time an army in excess of 1 million had been mobilized in Western history. From this moment until such time as its enemies shall have been driven from the soil of the Republic, all Frenchmen are in permanent requisition for the services of the armies. The young men shall fight, the married men shall forge arms and transport provisions, the women shall make tents and clothes and shall serve in the hospitals, the children shall turn old lint into linen, the old men shall betake themselves to the public squares in order to arouse the courage of the warriors and preach hatred of kings and the unity of the Republic. The wars merged into the Napoleonic Wars of the First French Empire from California, 1803. Over the coming 2 decades of almost constant warfare, it is estimated that somewhere in the vicinity of 5 million died, probably about half of them civilians, and France alone counted nearly 1 million deaths. In the Russian campaign of 1812, the Russians resorted to destroying infrastructure and agriculture in their retreat in order to hamper the French and strip them of adequate supplies. In the campaign of 1813, Allied forces in the German theatre alone amounted to nearly 1 million, while 2 years later in the 100 Days a French decree called for the total mobilization of some 2.5 million men. During the prolonged Peninsular War from 1808 to 1814, some 300,000 French troops were kept permanently occupied by, in addition to several 100,000 Spanish, Portuguese and British regulars, an enormous and sustained guerrilla insurgency. Ultimately, French deaths would amount to 300,000 in the Peninsular War alone. Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion was one of the deadliest wars in history, and the first total war in modern China. About 20 million people died, many due to disease and famine. It followed the secession of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom from the Qing Empire. Almost every citizen of the Heavenly Kingdom was given military training and conscripted into the army to fight against the imperial forces. American Civil War. During the American Civil War, Union Army General Philip Sheridan's stripping of the Shenandoah Valley, beginning on September 21, 1864 and continuing for 2 weeks, was considered total war. Its purpose was to eliminate food and supplies vital to the South's military operations, as well as to strike a blow at Southern civilian morale. Sheridan took the opportunity when he realized opposing forces had become too weak to resist his army. Union Army General William Tecumseh Sherman's march to the sea, in November and December 1864 destroyed the resources required for the South to make war. General Ulysses S. Grant and President Abraham Lincoln initially opposed the plan until Sherman convinced them of its necessity. Scholars taking issue with the notion that Sherman was employing total war include Noah Andre Trudeau,